Imagine you could go back in time, not to the gilded halls of London or the marble floors of a European palace, but to the raw, untamed edge of the known world. To a place where the air smelled of pine resin and salt water, where men with mud on their boots and fire in their eyes were quietly building fortunes that would have made the average nobleman choke on his wine. We're talking about the American colonies in the 1700s. And if you think wealth in that era was all powdered wigs and plantation houses, you are only seeing the surface of something far older, far stranger, and far more ruthless than most history books dare to tell. Today we are going inside four trades, four corners of a colonial economy that has been almost entirely forgotten, that turned ordinary men into some of the wealthiest individuals on the continent before the United States even existed. These were not gentlemen merchants sipping tea and signing polite agreements. These were operators, risk-takers, men who understood that the fastest road to wealth was not following the crowd but finding the thing the crowd could not do without. And in the 1700s, those things were blue dye, animal pelts, liquid pitch, and letters of marque. Stay with me, because by the time we're done, you will see the colonial world in a completely different light. Let's start with something that sounds almost too simple to be true. A plant? A weed, really, a scraggly, unremarkable shrub that grew in swampy lowland soil and smelled faintly bitter in the summer heat. This was indigo. And for roughly 4 decades in the mid-1700s, it was one of the most valuable commodities on earth. To understand why, you have to understand the world of European fashion and industry at that moment in history. Textile manufacturers across Britain, France, and the Netherlands were producing cloth at an industrial scale, and all of that cloth needed color. The dominant blue dye of the era came from a plant called woad, but woad blue was dull, it faded quickly, and the Europeans knew there was something better. Indigo, the deep, vivid, almost supernatural blue that came from the East Indies and Central America, was that something better. The problem was supply. Britain was getting most of its indigo from French and Spanish colonial sources, which meant they were paying foreign prices and depending on foreign goodwill. That was a problem that someone sharp enough could solve. Enter Eliza Lucas. You will not find her name in most standard history books, which is a profound injustice, because what she did between 1739 and 1744 in South Carolina was nothing short of an economic revolution. She was 17 years old when her father left her in charge of 3 plantations outside Charleston. 17. And instead of simply maintaining what existed, she began experimenting. She got hold of indigo seeds from the Caribbean and spent years failing, learning, adjusting, and trying again. Her first crops were destroyed by frost. A plantation manager she hired from Antigua allegedly sabotaged her processing to protect his own island's trade advantage. Still she kept going. By 1744, Eliza Lucas had cracked the formula. She had grown a viable crop and, critically, she had worked out the chemical process for converting raw indigo plants into the dry blue cakes that the textile industry demanded. She then did something remarkable. She distributed seeds to neighboring planters for free. She shared her processing knowledge openly. In doing so, she did not just create a business, she created an entire industry. Within a decade, South Carolina was exporting over 100,000 pounds of indigo per year. Within 2 decades, that number would climb past 1 million pounds annually. The British Parliament, recognizing how strategically important this domestic supply was, passed a bounty system, meaning they paid colonial planters a bonus on top of the market price for every pound of indigo they produced. That bounty made the margins extraordinary. Men who had been moderately successful rice planters suddenly found themselves sitting on land that produced liquid gold. The great planter fortunes of South Carolina, the ones that funded the most elegant townhouses in Charleston, the ones that sent sons to be educated in London and daughters to marry into old money, many of them were built on blue. The processing itself was brutal work, done almost entirely by enslaved Africans who brought with them knowledge of indigo cultivation from West Africa's own long tradition with the plant. The wealth of the indigo elite did not emerge from nowhere, it was extracted from human lives under conditions of absolute cruelty, and that history cannot be separated from the story of the fortune. But the economic mechanics of what indigo did to the colonial wealth landscape remain staggering. A planter with 150 acres of good indigo land, in the peak years of the bounty, could clear what would be roughly $250,000 in today's money, per season. That is the kind of return that rewired what people thought was possible. Now, let's travel north. Considerably north. Because while the southern colonies were turning purple plants into fortunes, an entirely different and far older economy was operating in the forests and waterways stretching from the Great Lakes down through the Ohio Valley and up into what is now Canada. This was the fur trade. And by the early 1700s, it was already a century old, already deeply entrenched, and still producing wealth at a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. The mathematics of the fur trade were elegant in their simplicity. In Europe, a single high-quality beaver pelt could fetch the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a skilled craftsman. Beaver fur was used to make felt hats, and in the 1700s, a fine beaver felt hat was not a fashion accessory, it was a status symbol. Lawyers wore them, merchants wore them, military officers wore them. The demand was essentially inelastic. No matter how many pelts arrived in London or Amsterdam, there were always buyers. On the American side of the equation, the supply required two things: access to the wilderness and relationships with the indigenous nations who actually knew where the animals were and how to trap them efficiently. The men who figured out how to build and maintain those relationships, and who had the capital to finance expeditions deep into the interior, became extraordinarily wealthy. The structure of the trade was essentially a distribution pyramid. At the base were the coureurs de bois, French-Canadian woodsmen who lived in the forest for months at a time, learned native languages, adopted native customs, and often married into native families. Above them were the voyageurs, the paddlers who ran the canoe routes carrying trade goods in and pelts out, through some of the most demanding waterways in North America. And above them were the merchant houses of Montreal, Albany, and later New York, the financiers who put up the capital, absorbed the risk, and collected the largest share of the profit. A successful fur trading operation in the early 1700s worked like this. A merchant would outfit a brigade of canoes with trade goods, iron tools, woolen blankets, copper kettles, glass beads, firearms, and rum. The total outfitting cost might run to a few £100 sterling. Those goods would be traded deep in the interior, sometimes traveling 1,000 miles or more from the nearest colonial city. In exchange, the brigade would return with pelts worth many times the original investment. Risk-adjusted returns of 500% or more were not unheard of in good seasons. But wealth in the fur trade did not come from a single good season. It came from position. The men who became truly rich were the ones who controlled the choke points, the key river junctions, the portage routes, the trading posts that sat at the natural crossroads of native trading networks. The Albany merchants who dominated the English side of the trade in the early 1700s wielded economic power that extended hundreds of miles beyond their city walls. They did not need to go into the forest themselves. They simply owned the infrastructure that everyone else had to move through. By the mid-1700s, the competition between British and French colonial interests over control of the fur trade became one of the principal economic engines driving the conflict that would eventually explode into the French and Indian War. Men were dying for market share. Entire geopolitical alignments were shifting because of where the beavers were. That is the scale at which this industry operated. If indigo built its fortunes quietly in the fields and the fur trade built its fortunes in the deep wilderness, the third of our great colonial trades built its fortunes in the stinking, smoke-blackened pine forests of North Carolina, and it smelled terrible. We are talking about naval stores. Specifically, pitch, tar, and turpentine. And if you have ever thought of those as minor industrial products, you have never thought about what held the British Empire together: wood rots. Rope frays. In the 1700s, the entire global trading and military system of Britain was built on wooden ships, and every single one of those ships required constant maintenance with products derived from pine resin. Tar was brushed onto the hulls and into the rigging to prevent rot and seal out water. Pitch, a thicker, more refined version, was used to caulk the seams between hull planks and make them watertight. Turpentine was used in paints, varnishes, medicines, and as a solvent. Without a steady supply of these products, the Royal Navy would literally fall apart in the water. Britain had historically sourced its naval stores from the Baltic, from Sweden and Russia primarily, but that dependency was a strategic nightmare. The supply could be cut off by war, embargo, or the political whims of foreign monarchs. When Britain finally made a serious push to develop domestic colonial production, the result was a bounty system that would feel very familiar after our conversation about indigo. The British government paid colonial producers a bonus for every barrel of tar, pitch, and turpentine they shipped. That subsidy transformed North Carolina. The longleaf pine forests that covered the coastal plain of North Carolina were essentially a natural factory waiting to be exploited. The process was labor-intensive but not technologically complex. Workers, again, primarily enslaved men and women, would chip the bark from longleaf pines and collect the resin that oozed out into small clay cups or hollowed-out bowls at the base of the tree. This raw material, called gum turpentine, could be distilled into spirits of turpentine or boiled down into pitch and tar. The yield from a single healthy tree was small, but the forests were enormous, and once a family or planter established an operation with enough trees tapped and enough labor to process them, the income was reliable, recurring, and scalable. The men who built serious naval stores operations in the first half of the 1700s were often not wealthy planters to begin with. This is one of the more interesting social dimensions of the trade. It had a lower barrier to entry than tobacco or rice cultivation, and a number of the early fortunes in North Carolina and the Cape Fear region grew from relatively modest beginnings. A man who could organize labor, manage a still, and navigate the relationship with the royal customs inspectors who certified the quality of his barrels could build a genuinely significant operation within a decade. What the naval stores trade also did was make North Carolina, which was often considered the overlooked middle child between wealthy Virginia and wealthy South Carolina, into an essential node in the imperial economy. The colony shipped enormous quantities of naval stores to British ports throughout the first half of the century, and the merchant families of Wilmington and Bath who controlled that trade were not poor. By the 1760s, when the bounty system began to wind down and the political atmosphere between colony and crown began to sour, many of those same families had already converted their naval stores' wealth into land, into merchant shipping, and into the broader commercial infrastructure that would carry them forward into the Revolutionary era. Now we come to the fourth trade. And this one is different from the others in a fundamental way. Indigo farming, fur trading, and naval stores production were all industries built on patience, on planting, waiting, processing, shipping, and doing it all again the next season. The fourth trade we are discussing today was built on speed, on violence, and on a legal document that was essentially a government-issued license to steal. This was privateering. And in the early to mid-1700s, it made some men spectacularly, almost obscenely rich in the space of a single voyage. Here is the basic mechanism. When Britain was at war with another European power, which, in the 1700s, was most of the time, the Crown would issue documents called letters of marque to private ship captains. These letters authorized the holder to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels. Any ship captured was brought to a colonial admiralty court, where it was declared a legal prize. The ship, its cargo, and everything on board would then be sold at auction, and the proceeds split between the Crown, the ship's owners, and the crew according to a predetermined formula. This was not piracy, at least not technically. The legal distinction was clear: pirates attacked anyone regardless of nationality and were hanged when caught. Privateers only attacked enemy ships, operated under government sanction, and were celebrated as patriotic heroes when successful. In practice, the line was sometimes blurry, and more than a few privateers developed a relaxed attitude toward exactly which vessels counted as legitimate targets. But the legal framework was real, and it created a legitimate, and staggeringly lucrative, industry. The key to privateer wealth was not seamanship. It was capital. A privateer voyage required a ship, weapons, provisions, and a crew of 50 to 100 men willing to accept high risk in exchange for a share of the prize money. Outfitting a serious privateer vessel might cost thousands of pounds sterling, money that most sea captains did not have and had to raise from investors. Those investors bought shares in the voyage the way a modern venture capitalist might buy into a startup. The risks were enormous. A privateer crew might spend months at sea and find nothing. They might be captured themselves and spend years in a French or Spanish prison. They might be killed. But when the prize came in, when they took a heavily laden merchant vessel carrying sugar, silver, or manufactured goods, the returns could be extraordinary. During King George's War in the 1740s and the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and early 1760s, colonial ports like Newport, Boston, New York, and Charleston became essentially privateer headquarters. Wealthy merchants competed to finance the most heavily armed, most aggressive private warships they could put to sea. The newspapers of the era ran prize lists the way a modern sports broadcast runs game scores: how many ships taken, what was the cargo worth, when would the auction be. A successful prize auction in Newport could generate the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern terms, and the men who had invested in the voyage would see returns that no legitimate merchant trade could match. Some individual privateers became famous in their own lifetimes. Men whose names have largely faded from history but who were, in their day, the subjects of songs, pamphlets, and genuine public admiration. They were the venture capitalists and the action heroes rolled into one. And the colonial elite who backed them, the merchant families who put up the capital in exchange for their share of the prizes, used those profits to build some of the most elegant houses in colonial America, to endow churches and libraries, to fund political campaigns, and to accumulate the kind of social and economic weight that shaped the early republic. There is also a darker dimension to privateering that is important to acknowledge honestly. The line between a licensed privateer and an unlicensed pirate was kept firm only by war. When peace came, as it periodically did, the captains and crews who had been celebrated heroes found themselves suddenly unemployed, their skills wholly illegal, their earnings spent. Some made the transition to legitimate trade successfully. Others did not. The golden age of Caribbean piracy in the early 1700s drew heavily from the pool of experienced sailors whose privateer commissions had simply run out, and who found the transition to honest wages deeply unsatisfying. So what ties these four trades together? What is the thread that connects indigo farming in the South Carolina Lowcountry to fur trading on the Great Lakes to tar kilns in the North Carolina Pine Barrens to privateer fleets prowling the Atlantic shipping lanes? The answer is empire. All four of these trades existed because Britain had built a global economic system, and that system had gaps in it. Gaps where supply did not meet demand. Gaps where someone willing to take risks, move fast, and operate in uncomfortable or dangerous conditions could insert themselves and extract extraordinary value. The men and occasionally the women who got rich in the 1700s colonial economy were not waiting for opportunity to knock on their door. They were scouting the edges of the known world for places where the rules were still being written and the rewards had not yet been priced correctly. There is also the uncomfortable but inescapable fact that most of these wealth systems, especially indigo and naval stores, were powered by enslaved labor in ways that were integral rather than incidental. The fortunes were real. The work that created them was done by people who received nothing from it and lost everything to it. Understanding the colonial economy honestly means holding both of those truths at the same time. But the strategic lesson, the reason these stories still matter to anyone thinking about how wealth actually gets built, is consistent across all four of them. Find the thing that a powerful system cannot do without. Position yourself at the point where that thing is produced or moved. Be willing to operate where others are not willing to go. And understand that every era has its indigo, its beaver pelts, its pine resin, and its letters of marque. The names change. The mechanism does not. The colonial fortunes we have talked about today were not inherited. They were not accidental. They were built by people who looked at the edges of the known world and saw not danger but possibility. And in an era before venture capital, before stock markets, before any of the formal systems we associate with wealth creation today, they figured it out anyway. That is a story worth knowing. And that is exactly why we are here.